Uh, Hello YouTube. I wanted to make my weekly vid early this week, for a couple reasons. One, it's Super Tuesday, which here in the U.S. means that 22 states are having presidential primary elections today, and essentially, if you're not familiar with that, what that means is that there have been like 16 people running, and then it whittles down to 8, and then it whittles down to a couple front runners, and we're down to essentially 4 front runners and a couple of stragglers who really don't have a shot, but who are still invested in trying to get elected. And you go, depending on your party in the primary election, you go and vote for that party. So that means in order to vote in the primary, you have to declare yourself either a Republican or a Democrat. At least here in Arizona and in most states. Some states have open primaries. I'm not sure what those states are, but I know they exist. I've never lived in an open primary state, and I've lived in Arizona, Ohio, Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. And so I did that this morning. Got up early and went to the voting poll. Did my thing, and it was good to get there early because the crowd was slow. I figure a lot of people will go during lunch. At least I hope they go during lunch because it was dead, and that kind of concerned me a little bit. But I think that this election is so contentious that people are going to get out and vote, whatever their conscience dictates. And I hope that they do. I hope that everybody votes. Everybody who can vote should vote. Regardless of how useless you think it might be. There's a lot of pessimism about the process, and I understand that. I myself am sort of subject to that kind of pessimism, but I still think it's important to go and exercise my constitutional privilege to vote. So if you are thinking about not voting and you're registered, you really should go. Because democracy is kind of fucked up right now, American democracy. But I still think it's fixable. It's built in the system to repair itself. So that's my Super Tuesday bit. And it also kind of reminds me, like I've been thinking about some things, some conversational cycles. Bella, the happy loser, talking to Yokup. And I want to say, first of all, Bella, that I respect your optimism. I have so much respect for your optimism. I wish that, I just wish that I had that. I wish that I did. And I think in my job, I think a certain level of optimism is necessary. And I think I am in a lot of ways optimistic. I'm really optimistic. I think I'm idealistic. I believe that things can be better. However, I think that generally things are not all that good for a lot of reasons. But I respect your optimism. I respect your desire to communicate with people. And so I'm going to continue. I'm going to make more efforts to try and not shut the door on people like Yokup. Although I really am inclined to, because I grew up with people like him. I grew up around people like him. I lived a good deal of my early adult life around people like him. I know exactly where he's coming from. I know the inner workings of his brain. And, yeah. But I respect your desire to communicate. And I think that's one of the things I like most about you, is your desire to communicate. And so, kudos. But last video or 2 videos ago, you mentioned something in your response to my question. You mentioned the view of America during the 1980s, and that kind of struck a chord with me in a good way, because it sort of ties into some other things I've been thinking about. And I've always kind of maintained that I'm a disgruntled reject of the American dream, at least the American dream that I was raised on. And I think about the 80s. I grew up in the 80s, and I matured in the 90s, but I grew up in the 80s. I remember Reagan. I remember the Reagan era quite well. And it's interesting because, you talk about the perception of America in the 80s, and you're so right. And I think that the sad part about that is not only did the world see us that way, but I think a lot of us here saw us that way. We saw ourselves as a beacon in this notion that we could carry that light wherever we went. And the problem for me, though, came when I started to notice the disparities. Just in my small town. I grew up in a very small town in Ohio, very small. Once upon a time, it was predominantly an agricultural community, a lot of farmers, but it had been transitioning, and it's more or less become a suburb now. Not so many farms, mostly like condominium communities, housing communities, and people that drive to the city to work, which is like 40 miles away. And I noticed, and my family was actually fairly lucky, luckier than most, that other people's families were not so lucky. And the disparity started to bother me. And the town I grew up in is also very conservative, very conservative. Ohio is a red state, which means that it's predominantly Republican. The voters, people there vote predominantly Republican. And that entails a certain philosophy about how you spend money. And the thing I noticed is that especially in the 80s with Reagan and trickle-down economics, because Reagan deregulated a lot of industries, and he essentially broke the unions, and he gave money back to corporate. And I see this a lot in my students, like, well, all I have is my own experience, and my family was well off, so, corporations into the wealthy 1%. And the idea is if you give corporations and the wealthy 1% money, that it will then trickle down like the rain, and it will somehow hit the bottom, and that everyone will eventually prosper. It really quite worked out for the people who were not at the top of the shit heap. But anyway, and I noticed the disparities, and I looked at the people who were not as well off as my family was, and I noticed that it's not that they didn't work as hard. And as a matter of fact, I think in some ways they worked a lot harder. They had jobs that were more backbreaking. They had lousier hours, and yet they could never ever catch up. And that made me think. I mean, it's easy to say, and I see this a lot in my students, like, well, all I have is my own experience, and my family was well off, so well, you think you have to look. Comparisons. Look outside your little microcosm world. And it was very interesting because, it was always sort of assumed my brother and I would go to college. And so I was sort of told from the age of 5 or so that I was going to go to college, and that as long as I worked hard and did well in school and went to college and did well in college, that I would succeed. And it's been really interesting. I think I finally have arrived, I think, at least economically. I'm making more money now than I have ever in my life, and I feel pretty good about that. And I'm not one, because a lot of people in education gripe about the money, and I don't really care. I don't gripe about the paycheck because I've had far worse jobs. And I've had a variety of different kind of jobs. I lived, because I went to school, but then I quit, and I went back and quit several times, and had a lot of different kinds of jobs, very difficult jobs, factory jobs, back-breaking, lousy hours, low-wage jobs, assembly line jobs that steal your soul and hurt your feet and kill your back and numb your mind. And I guess I was lucky because, even when I was in those kind of soulless jobs, I always had my writing to keep me. Writing has been the thing that has maintained my sanity. But everywhere, in every scenario I was in, I always noticed the disparities, no matter how well I was doing or how badly I was doing. There's always somebody worse off, and it's easy to doubt of. And I noticed that, I still notice that in my students to this day. So nothing has really changed. The terminology we use to talk about the American dream changes, and we still use education as the great equalizer. But ultimately, no, it's not. It still isn't. And it's become more expensive. The system, the educational system is falling apart. We are failing. We're failing in our obligations to our students. We are failing in our obligations to and this is all tied in with my notion of the American dream, because education, as much as I sort of lollygagged through my education, Education is the thing that saved me. Education, not from being poor or growing up and being poor, but from my own fears of failure. Education helped me develop intellectually and in ways I probably would not have. And all this is tied into this notion of the American dream that I feel like failed me. And I think it not just failed me, but failed a lot of people. And it continues to fail them, because we're not looking at ourselves honestly. And that's what I thought about, Bella, when you mentioned the view of America in the 80s. That's all I got. This is the Buzz Monkey. This is Nick. And I'll talk to you later.